All right, good morning. My name is Jim, one of the pastors here. Good to have you. Glad that you're with us. If you are new here, you are coming in at literally the end of our study in the book of Daniel. We will cover Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12. We will finish the book of Daniel today and have been walking through it all fall, looking at this Old Testament book from a political perspective. How do we live as God's people, as young Christians? We are by and large still very, very much a young church trying to figure out how to take our faith into the public square. How do we think about what it means to follow Jesus and then live in the world that we live in? And so we've come to the end. How has it been for us? Has this been good, helpful for us? Okay, few of you, great. The rest of you get what you pay for. You know, it's sorry you didn't like it, but yeah, it's been helpful. It's been helpful for us, and so we come to the end. And so here's where I want to start. I've actually been waiting to teach this message, really all series for about a year or so now. I started hearing things. I started hearing out in kind of the secular world or the kind of the public world, just podcasts and writings and speeches, something that for me it was profound, not in what they were saying, but in who was saying it. So I'll give you an example. I was listening, this is a while back now, but I was listening to this interview. And so you've got this kind of conservative, right-wing, journalist who I think has a genuine faith now, that has, wasn't a Christian, but now recently seems to be, actually following the Lord in a very unique or not unique, but genuine way. And so this right-wing, hyper-conservative, Trump guy is interviewing this, for like 3 decades, this liberal, progressive journalist. And she has been championed by the left for a long time. And so he's interviewing her, and the conversation goes a certain direction. He says, I didn't think we were going to talk about this, but that's where it went. And what they were talking about was they were looking at the world and all that was happening in the political and cultural conversation. And she said it first, but he's said it before, and he's said it again. That she said they started talking about how it must be evil behind it all. And so she's like not a Christian. He, I think, is. She's like, kind of dabbling in religion and faith. I follow her on Twitter. Naomi Wolf is her name. And she'll like talk about spiritual things, and she's kind of looking at the Bible in ways, but it doesn't seem like she's quite there yet. But she's saying there must be evil behind some of these things. Here's what she said, quote, she said, "It feels like dark forces have been let loose all over the world." And so I just was struck by that, hearing Russell Brand, I think, was talking about it. It's like, this is Russell Brand. And so you have like these people out there in the secular world, in the public world, in the, on the podcasts, in the interviews, looking at our world and recognizing something that I wonder if Christians don't typically recognize. That what maybe has been behind all of it is that there are demonic and dark forces, empowering some of the stuff that we're seeing. And so that just kind of struck me. I was just like, I don't know that the church, I don't know that Christians are recognizing this, that what spiritual warfare is resistance, right? When Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against you, I think we get that image wrong. Gates are a defense mechanism. We're the ones advancing. The church is the one that's attacking. The gates of hell are trying to defend and resist what is just going to be true about the kingdom of God. It will prevail. And so what spiritual warfare is, then it's resistance. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be a defense up against us. And so we have to recognize the resistance that's happening in the world. And so here's my big question for us today. It's in 2 parts. Here's the first part of it. Where in the world, as you look at the world, where in the world might there be evil powers at work? Right? The things that frustrate you, the things that I don't like that. Jesus said in John 10 that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And so where in the world do you see exploitation, death, and destruction? Where do you see that in the world? Where do you see the resistance in the world that maybe that's actually demonic. Maybe that's why it's been so hard. So that's the first question. Where in the world might you see evil powers at work? And then the second one is, where in your life? Where in your life might there be demonic, evil, oppression, resistance at work? Addictions, disordered eating, pornography, alcohol abuse, suicidal ideation, bitterness, contempt, anger. Wherever you feel like you're hitting a ceiling, wherever there's resistance, might that be powers of darkness? And you're not just spinning your wheels because you're a terrible Christian, but there's actual resistance against you, and what you need is actual breakthrough. I don't mean to be over dramatic, but there's resistance in this room this morning. You can feel it. There's just a resistance. When there's a lack of faith, there's resistance. When we don't know the truth, there's resistance. When we've believed lies, there's resistance. When there's resistance, it's hard for us to sing. When there's resistance, it's hard for us to pray. We walk in, we feel a little skeptical. We walk in, we feel our guard is up and our expectations are low. That's resistance. Do you think the enemy wants you to come to church this morning and meet the living God? And so there's resistance. Now, I know there's skeptics among us and Christian and not, my first words are we're talking about demons and stuff, and some of you are like, come on, pastor, let's just give us some practical spiritual help and let's get out of here. There's some football to watch. And yet, if you think about it, I think there's a plausibility here that I want to just at least get you to agree with me on before we move forward, okay? Because if I just talk about demons all day and you don't believe in demons, it's going to be kind of a rough Sunday, you know what I'm saying? And so let me just say this, like most people think that humanity is generally good, and I would agree, right? That we are made in God's image. There's much love and good in the world. And so this idea of like darkness and demons, that's hard for you. All right, it's hard for you to think in that supernatural sort of way. People are good, people are generally good, and all of that is fine. But here's my question. How is it then, if people are generally good, there's much love and good in the world, how is it then that there is so much evil in the world? Why is it so broken then? Why? I mean, you only have to, you're in a bubble if you don't see that it is. All right, so why is the world so broken? Is it possible that the explanation for the atrocities and the amount of suffering in the world is because there are supernatural forces of evil? Most people, even like non-Christians, will believe that there's some sort of benevolent good, there's some sort of ultimate good in the world. Is it not possible then that there's an ultimate evil as well in the world? Right, and so Daniel, he's going to illustrate this reality for us today, that there is supernatural spiritual resistance to the church, to the Christian, at work, even in the nations, even in worldly kingdoms, and he's going to illustrate that for us today. Now, the main theme of Daniel is also the main theme of chapter 10, 11, and 12, and it's this, that God is over every human king and kingdom, and so we should not fear. Right? God is orchestrating literally 10,000 things in the world, geopolitically, culturally. God is at work in the details of all of that, and kings, they rise and fall at his command because he purposes all things according to the counsel of his will. That's just Ephesians 1:10. That's just a reality. God is at work over all of it. And so whatever happens in November, Trump, Harris, that happens under the sovereign will and plan of God. He's not very nervous. All right, God's not nervous, so neither should we. All right now you have powers and nations fighting. You have Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah, and you got Russia and Ukraine, not to mention China, North Korea. You have all these nations and powers that are doing evil, that are at work, but God is not nervous. He is over all of it. Right? You have the border crisis, you have inflation, you have abortion, you have transgenderism. None of that makes him nervous. And so we would be good that we recognize there's warfare. We would be good to sing the song of Psalm 131. This should be our song. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me, O church. Hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Right? This whole time we've been talking about how do we stay chill amidst the political and cultural fires, and the main way to do that is to recognize is that God is over all of it. Right? That God is over all of it. Right? And so even now as we come to the end of this book and we see and recognize the reality of some spiritual warfare, we're not nervous, but we do have to fight. Now, Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12 is long. Obviously not going to get into every one of the details. We'll be here too long even for me, okay? But it's one literary unit. It's one scene of the story, and it's the end of the story, and it's really going to communicate much of what he has already communicated in the book. It's going to, the vision that he gets, the prophecy that he gets, you'll find is going to be very, very similar, in fact, exact to the other dreams and visions he's received, just different perspective on them, okay? But in Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, we see, we kind of get a setting here. This gives us some historic context, that it's the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that a word was revealed to Daniel. So this is Cyrus's third year. In his first year, he let the Jews go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city. Remember, the Jews had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Their walls of their city were torn down. Daniel was one of the folks that were brought into Babylon and specifically into the king's court. Now, Cyrus, king of Persia, lets them go back. This is obviously by the move of God. This is all prophesied in the book of Jeremiah. But they go back and they're beginning to rebuild the temple, but they're discouraged from all the opposition they're receiving. So you can read about it in Ezra chapter 1, 2, 3, 4. In Ezra chapter 4, they stop the work because of all the resistance and the opposition that they're receiving. So you have to try to imagine where Daniel's at right now. Daniel doesn't go back with his people. He finds that he is called to stay with the king and to continue to be a counselor to the king, even as he worships the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he hears this edict 2 years ago. He's a part of it for the Jews to go back. You can imagine how encouraged he was of that. But then 2 years later, he receives news that the work has stopped. The work has stopped. And so he's going to begin to pray. Right? He's going to begin to pray and fast about all of this, but this is all happening in the political realm, these kind of warring cultures and nations, and Daniel's going to learn that the real drama is actually spiritual that's happening. And so in verse 2, he says, in those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. It's a long time, right? I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine. That sounds like a terrible 3 weeks, right? No meat or wine. Answered my mouth, he's fasting, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. And so this is a serious thing. Daniel hears about the opposition in Jerusalem. He's discouraged by it. His response is to fast and pray for 3 weeks. Now, fasting, it's one of those things like that is a real weapon in our spiritual tool belt that Christians in America don't typically wield very often. My wife and I were talking about this, literally, sounds like a great date night, right? On our date night, Friday night, we were talking about fasting, okay? As we were gorging ourselves on meat and wine, we were talking about how important, how we want to fast more, right? We were talking about fasting. And so you fast, right? We fast. Fasting strengthens your prayer. It sharpens your spiritual senses. So you begin to pray like better. You pray like focused. You pray in the will of God. Fasting is a way in which we might seek God's guidance. If you have a big decision, a big thing before you, what would it look like to maybe fast to seek God's guidance? In Nehemiah, they fast to express concern for the work of God. This is a big work, and we need God's help. And so we're going to fast. This is going to be this thing where we say, man, not by our strength, not by our physical might can we do this work. We need the Lord to move in this way. But I want to draw your attention to one other way in which, or why we would fast. It's to fast when you're in a spiritual war, right? So take Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus is baptized. The Spirit falls on him. God the Father says, you are my beloved Son. in whom I am well pleased. And this is right at the beginning of his 3-year ministry, right? 30 years. Jesus is just a laborer, right? He's just doing work, being a dude. And then, boom, God calls him into the ministry. It's time to do what he came to do. And the first thing that he does is the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights to be tempted by the enemy. 40 days and 40 nights of spiritual war. And what does he do? He fasts. He fasts. Right? Jesus, he fasts. Like, he might be physically weak, but he's spiritually like roided up. 40 days, no food, with the Father, praying, fasting, synced up with the Father, and the spiritual strength that is found in communion with God. Right? When we're facing a spiritual war, we might fast. And so Daniel, he's fasting and he's fighting, and he gets this vision. Right, so he gets this vision of an angelic figure who in verse 12 says, hey, 3 weeks ago, when you started fasting and praying, I came as a messenger, but the prince of Persia withstood me, right? What does that mean? Right, so an angel shows up and says, I was going to come 3 weeks ago, but it took me a while, not because I-20 is still not done ever, but because the prince of Persia withstood me 21 days. Reminds me of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians 2:18. Hey, we wanted to come to you, but Satan hindered us. We wanted to do this thing. We wanted to do this thing for the kingdom of God, the glory of God. We wanted to come visit you, but Satan hindered us. And then in verse 20, the angel says, do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I'm going to tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There's none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. And so the curtain is being pulled back for Daniel. What he sees geopolitically around him, what he sees in regards to the politics, the pressure, the persecution, the posturing, the positioning of culture around him, he recognizes behind it all is a spiritual war. That what the angel is saying is that the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece, these are demonic forces that are at work in all that Daniel has been observing and trying to navigate through. That actually behind the curtain isn't just, physical, political entities, but a spiritual reality and a spiritual war as well. The great Abraham Kuyper said this. He said, if once the curtain were pulled back and the spiritual world behind it came to view, it would expose to our spiritual vision a struggle so intense, so convulsive, sweeping everything within its range, that the fiercest battle ever fought on earth would seem, by comparison, a mere game. Not here, but up there. That is where the real conflict is waged. Our earthly struggle drones in its backlash. This is just the reality of Revelation 12, if you were here when we talked through that when Satan was thrown out of heaven, he began to make war on God's people and has been making war ever since. That's just a reality, that there is a spiritual war. And so then in chapter 11, verse 2, the angel says, I'm going to tell you what's been going on and what will happen. Right, I will show you the truth. Remember, Daniel is mourning over what's happening in Jerusalem, so this is going to be the angel's or God's answer through the messenger, the angel. Right, here's what's been going on. Here's what will continue to go on. And so in verse 2 again, behold, he says, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. Right, so we're not done yet, Daniel. There's 3 more kings that are still coming. And then a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. Of course, this is true historically. If you are at our Esther Bible study right now this fall, we've got some folks walking through the book of Esther. There are 3 more kings in Persia, and then the 4th king is King Xerxes. Right? In Esther, he's called Ahasuerus, which is kind of a little bit of a funny translation, which kind of means king headache. Okay, that's the Jewish way of he was a big headache, but this is Xerxes. Okay, and he was very, very rich, as the angel says here in verse 2. In Esther chapter 1, verse 4, he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness. right? He was the richest of the Persian kings. If you ever saw the movie 300, I don't know how old that movie is now. I think it's probably older than we would all like to admit. But the movie 300, that was Xerxes. Sparta, right, went to war against Persia. Persia defeated them, but it inspired the Greeks. And about 100 years or so later, they finally defeated the Persian kingdom. And so this is Xerxes here at the end of verse 2. And then we meet Alexander the Great at the end of verse 2. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Verse 3, then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. That's Alexander the Great. Right, so all of this should sound familiar. This is just like the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. This is the vision that Daniel had in chapter 8. These different kingdoms that are rising and falling, these different kings, but God is over all of it. And so Alexander the Great dies early, right? So he will do as he wills. Verse 4, and as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken. Alexander the Great died at the age of 32. All of this is true. His sons were murdered, and his kingdom was divided into 4 parts, each part ruled by one of his generals. And so then from here on, throughout the rest of chapter 11, the angel concentrates on these continuing battles between the armies to the south, which is Egypt, and the armies to the north, which is Syria. Why? Because Jerusalem is right in the middle. Okay, so the whole kind of message is just that there's going to continue to be fighting as kings and kingdoms rise and fall, and God's people are going to be stuck in the middle of it. Right? And so in the Old Testament, that was just a literal, physical, national reality. In the New Testament, it's also just a spiritual and cultural reality that we're going to be stuck in the middle of wars, actual wars, and just, philosophical wars, culture wars, that God's people are going to be stuck in the middle of continued war. That's just it's going to be continued conflict, and there will always be pressure for us to join a side. There will always be pressure for us to assimilate into the cultures around us. And so in Daniel chapter 11, we see these kind of ups and downs of all of it, but the point is just that it takes place under the sovereign hand of God, and we need not worry. We shouldn't be nervous, right? That God controls even the minute developments of human history. But then it transitions in verse 36 to what most commentators agree is the Antichrist. Talk of the Antichrist, okay? Y'all, we're gonna talk about demons and the Antichrist and politics today, okay? You gotta hang with me, okay? You gotta hang with me. At the end, we're gonna talk about spiritual warfare, and it's gonna be great. But in verse 36, the message seems to transition to a particular kind of ruler, what many have called the Antichrist. In verse 36, and the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. That is the very spirit of the Antichrist. He is about himself. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. The Antichrist is very simply a counterfeit Christ. Someone who has put themselves up in place of Jesus, the true Christ. And what's interesting is, I love how it ends. It's almost anticlimactic. Jump down to verse 45. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. I just love that ending, right? Like in the end, even the Antichrist is going to be helpless before the real Christ. When the Antichrist stands before the real Christ, there is going to be no match. Every other ruler is just a counterfeit before the real king. The New Testament speaks of it this way. I love this language in 2 Thessalonians 2:8. The Lord will consume him, the Antichrist, the Lord will consume him with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Right? Jesus will simply blow him away. God has no rivals, he has no equals, he has no peers. There's not going to be a fourth quarter comeback for the enemy. Jesus blows it, Jesus exhales, and he goes down. Right? That's the end of the Antichrist. Now, we have to spend at least a moment talking about who this is. And obviously, it is, I'm just kidding. We talked about this in Revelation, okay? There is no place in the Bible except for one, well, technically two, 1 John, 2 John, that speaks of the Antichrist. That uses that language, okay? So Daniel is certainly speaking of the Antichrist here. In Revelation, it speaks of the Antichrist. But to use that word Antichrist, it shows up 4 times in 1 John and 2 John. I'm going to show you them so we can learn some things. Children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Oh, so there's more than one, right? Antichrists, that's plural, okay? More than one. 1 John 2:22, who is the liar? But he who denies that Jesus is the Christ. This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. That's the Antichrist, okay? How about 1 John 4:3? Every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming, and now is in the world already. John wrote this 2,000 years ago, and he's like, Antichrist is here. Interesting, yeah, huh? That's right, John Lewis. 2 John 7, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Okay, so the Antichrist, there have been many of them, are counterfeits, false messiahs, false hopes, false gospels. They are false powers. They are nations even set up against God's people, kings who rule kingdoms that are trying to resist the advancement of the church. That is Antichrist. Satan has no creativity. He has no new ideas. He keeps running the same play over and over. He's just trying to resist what is inevitable, that God and God's church are eternal. And he's going down. Now, is there going to be a final kingdom set up against God's people? Will there be a final king and Antichrist set up against God's people? Yeah, there's got to be a last one. There's got to be a last one, and then Jesus comes back. And will that one be, more powerful than the rest? I don't know. Maybe. It seems so. Should we be concerned about it at all? No. Should we be trying to guess who it is? No, because there's been many Antichrists, and Antichrist even now is in the world, according to the scriptures. And so what the angel is trying to communicate to Daniel is that this is going to be the pattern. Kings rise and fall, kingdoms come and go, but God reigns above it all. In fact, he encourages Daniel in chapter 12, verse 1, when he says, but at that time, right, when Jesus finally ends the final Antichrist and his rule and comes back, but at that time your people shall be delivered. Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Is your name written in the book? Is your name written in the book? Right, Jesus says in the book of Revelation, he says, if you're an overcomer, if you're a conqueror, if you endure, even under pressure and persecution and suffering, and if you endure, I will never blot out your name from the book of life, he says. Is your name in the book? He says, he calls it the book of life of the Lamb who was slain, right? This book was purchased by his blood, sealed with the blood of Christ. If once your name is written in it, it can't be erased. It's in the book of Revelation, it's called the book of life from the foundation of the world. Right? This book was written before things even existed. In this book, your name was written before mountains ranged, before the moon mooned, before the sun shone. Like, this book was written before earth even began. Your name was written in this book. You think your name can be written out of the book? No, that's right. Out of the mouth of babes. This is the book written by God of those who trust in Jesus. right? Who follow the Lamb. If you're in this book, it doesn't matter what your story is. It doesn't matter what, like that one chapter in your story that you wish, that you regret, this book trumps that book. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And it essentially ends, verse 2, 3, and 4, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Right? This is when Jesus comes back. This is just Revelation 20, 21, and 22. What Daniel is to God's Old Testament people, Revelation is to God's New Testament people. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. What should we think about these things? What do we think about what the angel reveals to Daniel? In part, we admit that it's difficult. Even in verse 8 of chapter 12, Daniel says, although I heard, I did not understand. Which is interesting because at the beginning of chapter 10, he says he does understand, but I take this to mean that there's aspects of this that he just can't quite grasp. And so we can admit that we can't quite grasp some of this as well. But what should we think about this? Why should we care about such a long history lesson? Well, first, it's not a history lesson. At least when this was written, this is prophecy. None of that stuff had happened yet. Daniel never heard of Alexander the Great or Xerxes. That this is prophecy should blow our mind. This is astonishing if you think about it, that the Bible would foretell the future so accurately. Some of you still read the Bible like it's this sort of spiritual manual that it's kind of like this spiritual checklist and some things you can apply to your spiritual life. And so you're like, oh, that's a good idea. I should try that. And you read it like you would read any sort of self-help book. This is the story of God's redemptive purposes in human history. Right? This is spiritual, yes, but it's actual. It's spiritual, yes, but it's historical. Right, that God is writing the story of human history. And he's like, hey, Daniel, let me tell you what the next couple chapters are like. I already know them because I wrote them. Like that's just fascinating to me that this is prophecy. This isn't history first, this is prophecy first. And so the end of Daniel, it's communicating to us that the plans and purposes of God are not subject to the policies and politics of man. We're not subject to whatever Trump does or Harris does or anybody else does. Like we fall under the plans and purposes of God. That gives us great confidence then. I also thought about this. I love this. I just love how big God is and how small everybody else is in comparison. Like I just love that great men are afterthoughts. Great men of history are afterthoughts when they show up in Scripture. Like Alexander the Great and Xerxes, they get but a few lines, a sentence or two, like they're just a mere afterthought. Isaiah 40 verse 23 says, God brings the princes to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. Right, that Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, we honor them for the positions they hold. We pray for them because God, the Bible commands it, but they're not to be feared. They're not to be feared. Fear God. They don't even get a sentence in the Bible. Fear God. But the main thing that I want us to consider for our remaining time is this topic of spiritual warfare. Okay, so I think I've got this categorized in two things, but really I just want to rant about spiritual warfare, okay? So if you want to try to find some structure in the next 10 minutes, that's fine, but this is what I'm dying to talk about. In chapter 11, verse 31, again, I couldn't get into all the details, but this is talking about Antichrist. Antichrist was a Greek king, just before, maybe 100 years before the Roman Empire came into power. He was the little horn in chapter 8, if you remember the vision. In chapter 8, he's the little horn, or at least most commentators agree with that. And Antichrist profaned the temple, persecuted the Jews. All in all, he was a terrible guy. In verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress. They shall take away the regular burnt offering. So he's messing with the God's people and their worship. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Jesus talked about that in later in Matthew. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. Underline seduce with flattery. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Verse 33, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. And then verse 34, when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with, there's that word again, flattery. Underline that. Okay, underline that. So this is what's key here. Verse 32 and verse 34, he seduces with flattery, and many shall join themselves to him with flattery. So here's, step number one when you're thinking about spiritual warfare: don't agree, don't partner with evil. Don't agree with accusations, don't partner with evil. Most historians say that Antichrist, his success was because God's people partnered with him, agreed with him on some of those things. And so he was very successful in hindering the advancement of God's kingdom through the Jewish people. Sinclair Ferguson writes, evil cannot gain a foothold in the city of God unless it finds a spirit of cooperation among the visible people of God. That phrase, spirit of cooperation. My goodness. The New Testament, James 4:4, calls it friendship with the world. Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14 calls it partnership with darkness. In the Screwtape Letters, remember C.S. Lewis? He writes this fictional account of this demon who is writing to this, like, his nephew, kind of underling demon, and he's giving him counsel on how to, demonize this kid, right? Who had, becomes a Christian. He's like, you screwed up, and now he's going to try to resist him. And he says to him, he must not be allowed to suspect that he is now, however slowly, heading right away from the sun on a line which will carry him into the cold and dark of utmost space. That it's this kind of slow trajectory, this kind of slow, pull away from what is true and right and good. Don't let him realize that he's agreeing, that he's partnering with what is wrong, with what is dark, and being pulled away from the light of the sun. The main reason why the powers of darkness get a hold on us is because we cooperate. We agree. Meaning, their powers are powerless if we don't agree. We are strong enough in Christ. They have no hold on us. That's why Paul will say in Ephesians 4, what? Like, don't give the enemy a what? A foothold. Right? So no bitterness, no contempt, no unforgiveness. There's certain things that give the enemy a hold on you. Why? Because we agree. You're right. I should be mad at that person. You're right. I shouldn't forgive that person. And we start agreeing with that, gives the enemy space. Enemy has no power over you if you don't partner with him. Accusations only have power if you agree. This is what happens to people like you. You're not valuable. You're damaged. You're dirty. You're unworthy. No one is fighting for you. And we agree. And we agree. The identity issues that our culture is facing, by the way, it's all identity issues. Our confusion around sexuality, transgenderism, depression, mental health, the attack, that's an attack. Suicidal ideation. That's an attack on our identity. That's an attack on the image of God. That is from an enemy who wants to steal, kill, and destroy. Right? Those things, those are accusations that if you agree with, give the enemy a foothold. Right? They are an accusation around the very core truth of who you are in God, made in the image of God. Things like pornography, cutting, self-harm, disordered eating. There are certain things that have a level of darkness to them because they come from darkness. They come from darkness. Those things aren't just, you had a little bitty sin over here. No, those are chronic anxiety and worry. These things are from the pit of hell. And I wonder if we struggle with those things, if maybe we struggle with those things because at some point we have made an agreement with the enemy and we started believing some things that are just not true about a son, a daughter of Most High God. It's just not true about you, but you believe it. Some of you walked in here numb to God. Can't sing, can't pray, you feel far from God. This is often resistance, spiritual warfare, and there's probably underneath all of that a place where you agreed with something that is just not true. It's just not true. It's not that God is far from you. It's not because you're such a terrible sinner that he wouldn't, James said, we can approach the throne of God with boldness. And some of you are like, no, I can't. No, I can't. If you could approach the throne of God with boldness, well, we would have been singing, our hands would have been raised, some of us would have been on our knees, tears would be coming down our eyes, and we would say, God is in this house. But no, there's resistance. There's resistance. Don't agree with it. Your spiritual paralysis is because an enemy has anesthetized you at some point and you believed a false accusation, and so your faith is weak. And maybe that accusation came out of the mouth of a parent or a coach or a spouse or a significant other or a pastor, a spiritual leader, or whoever. But ultimately, it was Satan accusing you. Don't agree with it anymore. In a similar way, lies only have power if you don't know the truth. So accusations only have power if you agree with them. Lies only have power if you don't know the truth. If you don't know the truth and you believe the lie. I've been banging my head on this one thing, and all I can imagine is that this is just spiritual war. Right, Jesus said, I'll tell you what it is in a second. Jesus said that Satan is the father of lies. That's all, he said he's been lying since the beginning. The only language and dialect Satan knows are lies. And so some of you are hitting a wall and you're in bondage because you've believed a lie. A lie. Here's what, you guys are gonna hate this because I keep talking about it, but I can't help it. I've been banging my head against this idea of like, why are certain Christians okay with abortion? And I can't imagine it. Like, it's one of the biggest, obviously, political and cultural debates and arguments of this season and of our day, and I can't understand it. And you don't like it when I talk about it, but if this was 200 years ago and I was pastoring a church in the South and I didn't speak out about the evils of slavery, 200 years later, people would be wondering why. What a coward. What a coward that he wouldn't have said. The pastor of the Paradox Church didn't speak about it. What a coward. So I'm gonna talk about it. And I can't imagine why so many Christians are still okay with abortion. Right? 200 years ago, Christians in the South, right, on land that we worship on now, not only believed the lie that slavery was okay, they championed and celebrated it. It wasn't like, oh, it's kind of a necessary thing. No, they championed and celebrated it. Why? Because they were just evil people? No, they were deceived. They believed a lie. In the Old Testament, God's constantly speaking against these cultures, and then God's people who would adopt this culture of sacrificing their children to the god of Molech. And I want to be careful with the language I use because I know the kids are here. But the god of Molech was the god of the harvest and provided rain and provided food for the people. Were these people, were these crazy ancients that were, going up to a mountain and doing that kind of sacrifice to some, pagan god who they thought was going to provide food for them? Were they just evil? No, they were deceived. In their mind, if they didn't do this, there's no food. If there's no food, everybody dies. So one innocent person maybe dies for the feeding of thousands. We're gonna sacrifice on the altar of my life, my flourishing, the plans that I have, the purpose, my goals, my work. If I don't do this, if I don't sacrifice this on the altar of my life, what will happen to me? No, they were just deceived. They weren't evil people. They just were deceived that was somehow going to be okay, that was somehow the answer. It's deception. And listen, I don't think I've explicitly said this in a while. I have so much grace for you. This is my story. I was 18 years old and was a part of an abortion. I don't know that I championed and celebrated it, but man, I was relieved. So there's so much grace for you. We've been talking about a ministry for those of you that had an abortion. I'm not talking about human beings, women, men that were part of it. Many of them, it's moms taking their daughters. I'm not talking about there's so much grace for you. I'm talking about a systemic ideology that's somehow not utterly evil. And we believe the lie. It breaks the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Even so, do research, see what actually is happening. There's no short of information out there to see the unbelievable evil that it is if you just do a little bit of research. And so lies, accusations have power when we agree with them or believe them. Here's my last one. I don't even know what time it is. Here's my last one. Spiritual warfare. Stop fighting people and start fighting demons. Okay? Stop fighting people and start fighting demons. Daniel's praying. He's warring for 3 weeks. He's praying. Right? His war is a spiritual war. He's praying and fasting for 3 weeks. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. And prayer and fasting, it's one of our main weapons. Mary, Queen of Scots, Bloody Mary, she was quoted as saying that John Knox, this great pastor, man. Pastors used to be something, they used to be something. John Knox, great pastor in Scotland, she was said to have feared his prayers more than any other invading army. Our prayers have power, right? Our fasting is power. We have any Steelers fans in here? I saw this clip, I think it was last year, Mike Tomlin, the Steelers coach. And so one of the Steelers players was fighting, in between plays while the play clock was running down, and they get a delay game penalty. And so there's this clip where he kind of, goes to the sideline, and Mike Tomlin walks up to him and just kind of gets into his face a little bit. And he's like, while you're fighting, the clock is running. Right? While you're fighting, the clock is running. And then he says to him, he says, isn't the cause bigger than you? I just think some of us, we're fighting our little petty battles, and we're fighting people while the clock is running. And there's a bigger cause than you. There's a spiritual war, and you're out here fighting all these other kinds of wars, right? That we have to stop fighting people, we have to start fighting demons, that there is resistance. There's resistance. And so we have to fight a spiritual war with spiritual weapons. Some of you are trying to fight political battles right now, not realizing that if you pull back the curtain, it's not a political battle, but a spiritual one. And so, yeah, sure, vote. You should vote. And however involved you are in politics and government, do your thing as God has called you, but don't forsake the real battle, which is prayer and fasting. Same thing, some of you are fighting people and not demons in your relational life, right? Stop fighting your spouse. Fast and pray and fight the enemy. Stop fighting the Democrats or the Republicans. Fast and pray. Stop fighting your past. Fast, pray, fight the enemy. Spiritual warfare, it has to be fought with spiritual weapons. Has to be fought with spiritual weapons. Let me just close with this story. I told this a couple of years ago, and it's just too good not to tell again. There's this guy named Jamie Winship who essentially is kind of contracted with the CIA to go do negotiations, so to speak, with Muslim nations and tribal nations and things like that. Anyways, he has this, to make a long story short, he has this conversation with this ruler and gets him to change a law against Christians. No, you can't kill Christians anymore. He's like, yeah, you're right. We're not going to kill Christians anymore. He's like, we got to go tell all these tribes and all these, different sects, because they're recruiting all these young men and they're going to persecute the church. And you got to go talk to them. So he goes out to talk with one of these tribes and tribal leaders, and he brings a couple of guys with him. One of them's like legit Jason Bourne. Okay, it's kind of cool. And so anyways, they get there and they're like, okay, we're gonna get there at night. They're gonna have a tent for us. We're gonna go to sleep. And then the next morning, they're gonna have food set for us. They're gonna let us eat by ourselves because that's their custom. And then we'll start having these conversations, right? So they wake up the next morning, they go into another tent where the food has been set for them. It's him and 2 other guys, so 3 total. And they go into this tent and there's 4 place settings set. They're like, oh, that's weird. So then they just eat breakfast and then they go into this other tent and they start having these negotiations and these conversations with the tribal leaders, and they're going well. And they have meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Next day, breakfast again. They go into the next, one of the final meetings, and every time there's 4 place settings. 4 place settings. So they show up, this final conversation, things are going well. And so finally he asked them, he says, hey, why do you guys keep setting 4 place settings at our meals? And it's translating and some things are happening, and they look at each other and then they look back at him and they say, what do you mean? There's 4 of you. And so Jamie Winship, Jason Bourne, some other guy are like, what is he talking about? And so they look back at him and they say, what do you mean there's 4 of us? There's only 3 of us. And the guy said, yeah, but then there's your security guard. We wanted to ask you, why does he stand outside your tent and why does he hold the sword? Right, so the Muslim leaders saw an angel outside of their tent, and the 3 Christian Americans had no idea. There's a spiritual war. Daniel pulls back the curtain so we can see that there's a battle to fight. The gates of hell will not prevail against us. We have nothing to fear, but we do need a war. We do need to fight. And so I just want to call you to that right now. That you would come before God and you would decide today that you're going to start fighting a spiritual war. That you're not going to be stuck in the ways in which you've been stuck. That addictions don't have to have a hold on you anymore, that your past doesn't have to grip you, and there's been a lot, too many this year of people in our midst, in our church, who are tempted to self-harm. Just places in your life that are still in darkness. What if we decided today that we're not going to stay there anymore, but we're going to fight? And so we're going to fight by singing. We're going to fight by praying. Prayer team, even pastors are going to be up here. Don't leave here today without fighting. So Jesus, you are our warrior king, our servant king who knows us and loves us. We are not afraid. You rule over all things. Our names are written in the book of life. We believe that. We believe that. In Jesus' name, amen.